Shalom, my name is Aaron, and it's good to see you again. But we're just about to start the book of Exodus, and our first Torah portion is called Shmot, which is actually the name of the whole book, by the way. Now, the book is called Exodus in our Bibles, and we get that name from what's called the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible made a couple of hundred years prior to the first century, prior to Jesus. And it was made in Alexandria. And they chose to not call the book Shmot, or names in Hebrew, but to call it the Exodus, because their focus of the text, of the story, was the Exodus from Egypt. Although the book has about 11 chapters of the Jewish people getting out of Egypt, and then it has about 15 chapters of how to build a tent. Okay, building the ark, the Mishkan, the tabernacle. So the book has more information about the Exodus than not. But that was the focus for people who were living in Alexandria, who were living in Egypt. In Hebrew, the name of the book and its sort of central theme is a bit more than just the Exodus, although that is the most central redemptive event for the Jewish people prior to the first century. The book is called Shmot, which is the Hebrew word for names. Shem is one name. Shmot is the plural for names. And it's a book about identity. At the beginning of the text, in chapter 1, you end up with the idea that the children of Israel go down into Egypt, and it starts off by saying, now these are the names, these are the Shmot, the names, of the children of Israel who came to Egypt, each with his household and his clan. And then you get a series of names, which we've already had before. Jacob, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Dan, all of them, Zebulun, they're all there. And even it tells that Yosef was already in Egypt. And then they do what they're supposed to do, which is they multiply and they grow and they begin to come a multitude, a people. So they go into Egypt as a small clan, and they grow and they develop there. But once you get past those names, that initial few verses, then the next series of chapters, people are struggling to actually have a name. No one's getting a name. And the book is a struggle for identity. Moses is going to struggle for his identity as well as who he is and get his name. God will actually reveal his name to Moses clearly in this book. That will occur in the next Torah portion, which we'll talk about next week. But that along the way, people are going to find out who they are. And a lot of the time you actually discover who you really are through a trial, through an adversity. We don't always like to think that. We would probably all wish that we wouldn't go through trials and tribulations. In fact, it's included in the Lord's Prayer, right? Don't let me pass through the day of trial, but deliver me from evil, or the evil one. But it's often through suffering, as Paul would say, that you actually develop character and hope and work out who you really are. So this is actually a search for identity in this book. And so the people begin in Egypt, and they're actually doing what they're supposed to do. They actually begin to flourish. However, they get into trouble. A new king arises in Egypt, we're told. He doesn't get a name. None of the pharaohs ever get a name. They're just called Pharaoh. Daughter of Pharaoh's not going to get a name either. And he doesn't know the Israelites. And so he will then begin to oppress them. And for the Jewish sages, they look back and they look at this text and they say, we were doing what we were supposed to do, and it got us into trouble. Okay, we were obeying God, we were being fruitful, we were being good citizens, we weren't causing any trouble, no one was planning a rebellion, and yet people don't like us and we're persecuted. And that's been true of Israel through the centuries, up until this modern period. And it's also been true of the Christian church. When we go out and honor the Lord and submit to his will and do his will, then you get kickback. Then the culture cancels you and in some cases puts you into prison, and perhaps even worse. So we actually see this sort of thinking, the theology, and this sort of the meaning of life being put here. We're doing God's will, and yet we're in trouble. So a new king arises who doesn't know the people of Israel, and he has no name. And he sees that the people of Israel have grown. They're even more than the Egyptians. It actually says that. It says in verse 8 of chapter 1, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the people of Israel, or the children of Israel, the Bnei Israel, they're beginning to find their identity as a nation. They're called the sons of Israel. They're more and mightier than we are." I mean, who knew that the Jewish people were actually far more in numbers than the Egyptians? And so the Egyptians begin to oppress them, and they set their taskmasters over them to burden them, and they begin to build store cities. And in verse 13, it says that the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage in water and brick, and in all manner of service in the field. Actually, these verses are actually included in the Passover liturgy, still used to this day. This sort of idea of looking at the beginnings of Israel. And the beginnings of Israel is not a pleasant one. But Israel is incubating inside Egypt. The king, our Pharaoh, he changes his name from Melech Mitzrayim, king of Egypt, to Paro, Pharaoh. He orders that the Hebrew midwives will exterminate the boys and keep the girls. Okay, seems like a simple plan, but our midwives are God-fearers. They fear God, or in Hebrew, it says that they yirat Elohim. They still don't call God by his name because he hasn't actually revealed that identity to them yet, and they refuse to obey the king's command. Now, they actually get names. They get the names of Shifra and Pu'ah, which are names for beauty, different ways of saying fair or beautiful. And but how do we know that they're God-fearers? In what capacity would they understand God at this stage? And if we're honest, then we realize that the children of Israel have a very limited knowledge of God, not like we do today. They didn't have a Bible. They didn't have a temple. They hadn't been to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. Moses hasn't come as a redeemer. They don't have any prophets or priests. So their knowledge of God is purely based on essentially the oral tradition, campfire stories, that there was a guy called God, and he's very big and powerful. He made the world, and the world went bad, and then there was a boat and a rainbow, a wandering nomad, and now we're all here. But they fear God. It's touched to the point that they know that there's something bigger than them. There's something bigger than Pharaoh who's in front of them. There's something bigger than the culture that they live in. There's something bigger than the situation and the mess that they're in. And so they're going to obey and fear God and not submit to the local culture. And there are people, even in our current day, who, while having no knowledge of God, no Christian upbringing or education, can still look at creation and the universe and say there's something bigger than what's going on. And I can put them on the search for the divine. It can put them on the search for Jesus. It can put them on the search for the Spirit. Paul says in Romans that that no one is without an excuse. You can't say to God that there was no way that I knew you existed. I've had no opportunity to know your existence. That doesn't happen. So the children of Israel continue to thrive. Well, Pharaoh is going to ignore his midwives. They're not very helpful to him. So he passes the law to exterminate the children, and this sets up the Moses story, and it begins in chapter 2, where it starts like this. Chapter 2 of the book of names of Exodus, Shmot. And a man from the house of Levi, went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him for 3 months. So immediately we have some characters: a man, a wife, a baby, and no names. No one has a name, even though later in the text we will actually get their names. But for now, they remain without an identity. No one has one. They're just man, woman. They're just Hebrew slaves. And she sees that she has a male child, and she hides him for as long as she can. But sooner or later, she's going to have to do something. And what she does is she takes him and puts him on an ark, and that's actually the word that's used to describe the boat, or the little box that they put the baby in. The word is ark, same word for the boat that Noah built. And unlike the movies which have our little baby Moses going through the river, she actually just places him around the reeds, and the reeds sort of kind of protect him. This might have actually been a very common thing that a lot of the women done. Moses might not be unique in this fashion. And so the Moses' story is essentially the beginning. Is miraculous. He's actually saved from a very terrible tyrant who's out there to kill all the babies. This does sound a lot like the way Jesus had his story as well, with the slaughter of the babies in Bethlehem. An evil tyrant goes out to destroy the young, and instead of succeeding, he fails. And in this case, in irony, he ends up bringing the baby into the house of Pharaoh. But he does it through the daughter of Pharaoh. In verse 5 of chapter 2, then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river. She has no name. And so everyone here so far in the story is without a name. And the sister who's standing off watching, even though we know her name is Mary, she ends up with no name. And when she opens up the baby, the box, she knows it. I'm looking at a Hebrew baby. Now, how did she know that? Okay. Sometimes people think, oh, maybe because he was circumcised. Well, Egyptians actually practiced circumcision. The Hebrew slaves were not allowed to, even though that was supposed to be a sign of the covenant. In Jewish midrash, what's a midrash, I hear you ask? It's a story that's not true, but is used to tell a truth. So they have a midrash that when Moses was born, he was born circumcised. So they attribute his birth to the miraculous. So the heroes of God have miracle births. So the charge that Jesus is born of a virgin and that would never happen, it's not a miracle. We don't believe in miracles in our children. That's actually not true. The Hebrew context is that the heroes of God have miraculous births. And as you go through the Bible, you end up with lots of miraculous births. Samson and Samuel have miraculous births. John the Baptist is a miraculous birth. There's lots of miraculous births in the Bible. Well, she takes compassion. She falls. She has compassion on our little baby, and the word compassion in Hebrew is chemla. It's one of my personal favorite words. And it's through her compassion that instead of obeying her father, she takes Moses into her house, Beit Paro, to the household of Pharaoh. And she's the one that names him Moses. Moses is not a Hebrew name. It's an Egyptian name. So Moses is beginning to find his identity. First, another little miracle occurs. It shows the compassionate side of God here too, that the baby needs to be nursed. Pharaoh, the daughter of Pharaoh, hasn't had any of her own kids perhaps, and doesn't have the ability to provide milk. So they end up getting Moses' mother, still unnamed, and she nurses him for a while. But when he's weaned, he goes into the household and he's raised as an Egyptian with an Egyptian name. Now, in the tradition and in our own stories, we often think of Moses as being a prince of Egypt, as being sort of, alongside the other sons and daughters of Pharaoh. But nowhere in the book of Exodus does it even remotely imply that Moses is a prince of Egypt. And as we go through the Torah, we'll try and see. Now, I know that might hurt some of our images of Moses, but it's what's in the text. In verse 11 of chapter 2, we begin to see Moses struggling with his identity, but beginning his journey of finding out who he is. It says, "Now it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and to look on their burdens." So, Tetzei Moshe, Moses went out. When Jewish people hear the Bible, remember in the ancient world, you didn't read the Bible because having a scroll like this was actually quite expensive, and there just weren't a lot of them. So you heard the stories of Moses. When you hear the word Tetzei Moshe, and Moses went out, it reminds you of other stories of people going out. Tetzei Dinah, and Dinah went out. And every time someone goes out, they get into trouble. And so you ask the question, what are you going out from? What are you going out to? What's causing you to go out? There was something happening in Moses' life that caused him to do this. Now, just like Jesus, we don't have any of his childhood stories. We have Moses' miraculous birth. We have his miraculous salvation from the mad king. And then that's it. Very similar to Jesus. Jesus has his miraculous birth. Jesus has his salvation from babies that Herod wanted to kill. And then all of a sudden, he's a grown man. Just Luke gives us that one little image of when he was about 12. But apart from that, we have no childhood stories of Jesus, just like Moses. Jesus is in the same pattern, in the same way, the new Moses. And it's very much what the Gospels want to produce and project to us. So Moses goes out, he's struggling with his identity, and he goes to his brethren. So he knows, I'm not Egyptian, I'm not treated like an Egyptian. These Hebrew slaves, they're actually closer to me in blood. Now, maybe he remembered some things that his mother said. Not sure, the text doesn't say. But he's looking for something, and he ends up encountering an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And Moses gets angry. So we're learning that Moses has some bit of an anger management problem, which will get him into trouble in the book of Numbers. And he kills the Egyptian. And for the Jewish sages, when they're making comments, they take this story and they think, well, why would Moses have done this? If Moses was a prince, if Moses was third or fourth in line to the throne, then he wouldn't have to have killed the Egyptian. He could have just said, stop, and the Egyptian would have had to have obeyed. But instead, what you find is you end up finding Moses kills the Egyptian and then buries the Egyptian, as though he knows he's in trouble if he's discovered. The Jewish sages make a comment and they'll create a midrash, again, a story that's not true, but that tries to tell the truth. They'll say that this Egyptian, he has actually had done bad things. He had actually raped the Hebrew man's wife. Now, they're trying to justify what Moses had done. And to be fair, if we're going to be fair before we point the finger and accuse, many of our own commentators do exactly the same thing. Actually, what you have is Moses with an anger management problem, and he is a killer. Now, in the sacred history of the people of Israel, in the sacred history that's in our Bible, the majority of the leaders of Israel are all killers. They have all actually taken life. Abraham went to war. David goes to war. All the judges, Gideon, Samson, they all go to war. The kings of Israel go to war. Moses is also a killer. We often in our society link murder and killing together, but those are two different things. They are not the same thing. Now, I'm not advocating them to go out and kill people. It's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's something within the character of the leaders of Israel that they have the power and the strength to be able to have to do this. Not everybody can. Not everybody can do such a thing. It takes a certain type of character. But that's not the character of leadership that actually the Bible is going to suggest is the best. And that's actually answered a little bit later in this Torah portion. The next time Moses goes out, which is the very next day, he discovers that there are two Hebrew people, two males arguing with each other. Not giving any names, but the sages, the Jewish sages, will actually finally give them some. They will call them Dotan and Aviram, who end up being Levites who join Korach in the rebellion in the desert and are swallowed up by the earth. And Moses, in the discussion, notices that they actually know what he's done. He is afraid. He's afraid that Pharaoh will come and get him. And they actually ask him, who made you a prince and a judge over us? That's in verse 14. And so again, if Moses really was a prince, this question would actually make no sense. So Moses flees, and he flees to Midian. Why Midian, I hear you ask? Well, Midian in the Bible is actually the son of Abraham. Abraham, through his wife Keturah, had another series of children, and one of them was Midian. And so Abraham, just by definition, would not have taught his sons paganism. He's a monotheist. He's the first believer. He's the first Jewish person. So there's a very good chance that he also circumcised all of his kids, just like he circumcised Ishmael and Isaac. And so Midian, his initial foundation as a nation is actually a very positive one, God-fearing, which is exactly what we find when Moses runs there. Maybe Moses goes there because he's heard of an oral tradition that these are actually sort of second, third, fourth cousins of us. They're actually kin of a fashion, and they seem to have a knowledge of God, because he ends up becoming the son-in-law to the priest of Midian, who has a really good name to start with. Moses ends up by a well, where he ends up finding his wife. Interestingly, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses all find their wives at wells. There's something about the idea of a well, which is life in the desert, which is water and flourishing, and a wife, which is also life and flourishing and growth and development. Well, Moses meets the leader of the clan, of this Midianite clan, and his name is Ruel in chapter 18, which means shepherd. Ro'eh is a shepherd in Hebrew, so Ro'el, shepherd of God. So his name, he also is called Jethro. This is true. Jethro ends up with quite a few different names in the Bible. His identity initially comes to us as shepherd of God, and he lives near the mountain of Horeb, which is otherwise we know it as Sinai, although the Bible actually uses the word Horeb more than it does the word Sinai. The mountain of God is known by this name. Horeb is an interesting word. The actual root of it means sword or destruction. So it's kind of a strange thing to be calling this mountain. Maybe it was volcanic, and so it gets a name that is terrifying and powerful, because when Moses is on the mountain, there's earthquakes and there's fire and ash, and so some commentators will actually comment that this actually is a volcano. Possible. The word can also mean sort of in terms of like desolation or dry, or sort of there's a certain lack of something like water. So it's a very interesting name for God, or for a mountain to be called the mountain of God. but that's its identity. Its identity is as the mountain of God, and Moses ends up becoming a shepherd. And many of the leaders of Israel, as well as being warriors, are also shepherds. In Sukkot, when you build your little sukkah and you're going to invite people in, you're looking to find the 7 holy shepherds of Israel, the patriarchs that will come and sit with you, eat with you, but also guide with you. Or as Paul says, entertain strangers, because you never know, you might be entertaining angels unawares. So while Moses is in this foreign land, he has children and becomes a successful farmer. Although for his father-in-law's flock, not for his own. So he actually hasn't become a leader of this community in any size, shape, or form. So what is it about Moses that he now should be able to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? What is his character? So far, as we've learned from Moses in this chapter, is struggling with his identity. He grew up in a much better household than had he have actually grown normally with his brothers and sisters and parents as a Hebrew slave. He doesn't quite know who he is. He's got an anger management problem. He doesn't face up to his past sins. He runs away, and according to the tradition and the New Testament, he spends 40 years out in Midian. 40 years, never once thinking about, or according to the text, going to Pharaoh, going to want to help them at all. And so what is it that makes God choose or know when his character is ready, when his hero is ready to go and be the shepherd of Israel? And the story is in chapter 3 with the burning bush. Starts off in chapter 3 that Moshe, was tending the flock of Yitro. Now Jethro, now Ruel, has his another name, probably more like his real personal name. Moses has gotten to know him as a father-in-law, so his name has changed. His identity is father-in-law. And his name is Yitro. He was the priest of Midian, so he has an interesting title. And he was leading the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God, where the angel of the Lord appears to him in a flame inside a bush that doesn't catch fire. And for the Jewish sages, they look at this text and they say, what is it? When does God know that his hero is ready? And so they have a midrash. And most of you would have seen this midrash in the movie Prince of Egypt, where Moses is tending the flock, and he notices that one of the sheep or the lambs has gone missing and gone wandering off. So he leaves the other sheep and he climbs over the rocks and he scuffs his knees on the briars and the thorns and the thistles as he searches for this silly sheep. And finally, when he sees that underneath a rock the lamb has given up, he bends down to pick up the lamb, and then behind him, the bush catches fire as God says, finally, my hero is ready. Why? Because he has compassion. He has that word, chemla. He has gone after the weak one. He's gone after the lost. He hasn't just abandoned the weak, he cares for the weak. So what sort of character trait is God looking for in his heroes? He's looking for compassion. To be a true hero of God, to be a true leader of the people, you need to have compassion. And Moses has it. Daughter of Pharaoh had it, which saved Moses in the beginning. Now Moses encounters the Lord, takes his sandals off, he's in holy ground, and he gets the call to go back to challenge Pharaoh. Now, Moses will argue, Moses will debate, but he is going to go back and hear and do the will of God and initiate the redemption, because his hero is ready. At the end of chapter 2, we're talking about the children of Israel who are still suffering in the land of Egypt. In chapter 22, verse 24 and 25, we read, So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. And when we think of the word memory or to remember, it's not about forgetting. It's not that God can forget his people, that he's forgotten them for the last 400 years. It's that when you remember in the Hebrew thought, something is about to happen. You're about to act on the covenant. And so God is about to act on the covenant of God that he has made with Abraham and Isaac. And God looked on the Bnei Israel, on the sons of Israel, and God knew them. My translation says, and God acknowledged them. But in Hebrew, it says that, I'll just read the last verse of chapter 2. It says, V'yirah Elohim et bnei Yisrael, and God saw the sons of Israel, v'yada eleihem, and he knew them. And the word is from lada'at, to know. And there are several words in Hebrew to know. One is makir. If I just wanted to say, I know you, I say, ani makir otcha, I know you. Or I know that guy. And it's a type of knowledge. I know you in terms of being familiar, etc. But if you say the word Abraham knew his wife Sarah, then you understand it's an intimacy. It's a very intimate way of knowing. It's very, very close. And so God knows his people in Egypt. He knows them intimately. Interestingly, they don't know him. So God knows people when they don't even know him. This is the compassion and the glory of God. The children of Israel don't yet have come to their identity. They haven't learned who God is. God hasn't revealed himself, but he knows them. And we know people like that in our families. We know people like that in our communities. People that God knows intimately, but people don't know God yet. So we should pray for them. We should bless them. We should ask the Holy Spirit to go out and woo them to himself, because God is not going to leave them alone. God is going to remember his covenant. God is going to act on their behalf. And in this story, he's going to use his hero. He's going to use his apostle, his shaliach. He's going to use Moses, who is now really coming in to his identity. So I look forward to seeing you next week as we continue the story.